How does one keep track of both the transcendence and the immanence of the God at the same time?
Do you need to?
Can you keep track of two of anything at the same time? I think it's a property of awareness in the mind that we can really pay attention to one thing at a time.
How does even one begin to keep track of either the transcendence or the immanence, if not both at the same time?
Well, I mean, that's the question. Are they really both the same thing? And yes, they are. But
well, at least they're not two.
Right. Well, I guess from a methodological point of view, I guess I'd ask the question, why do you want to do that? You know that God is infinite, you know that God is absolute, and that He is transcendent, and He is immanent, and you know that as principles, and you know that as doctrine, and you believe that it's true, and it obviously is true. So now you're talking about knowing that? Well, you can't know an abstract like that. Particularly when you're talking about God and reality, you have to know it in yourself, in your own experience. And that experience transcends these conceptual boundaries that are imposed by language and observation.
Yeah, I would say there are modes of awareness and modes of remembrance, because when you have an experience that inspires awe, then you're approaching transcendence. And when you have an experience that, like you might have just in the sunshine in a flower-filled meadow, you might just feel the presence. It's immanent. It's right here. It's all around. So I think of it as just, when I'm thinking about it, I find that transcendence and immanence have their place in situating things. But outside of thought, there's a transcendent flavor to experience, an immanent flavor. And what is it the flavor of, if not the divine itself?
Yes.
Regardless of the manifestations that might be in front of us. So, for me, even though I'm very cerebral, I think of it on the level of feeling.
Did you say on the level of feeling?
Yeah, exactly. It's like for me, it's two modes of feeling the divine presence.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. It's two ways of experiencing the same thing.
Yes, but it is two different ways.
Right, and the question about, how do you keep one in mind while experiencing the other way? I just think that just doesn't come into play.
No, I don't think you need to. And if you know one from the other, and you're able to register them in some fashion, then alhamdulillah.
Would either like to comment on, does that make sense?
It does.
When one is physically ill to the point that it interferes with their practice of the path due to a chronic condition, not something that's necessarily fatal, that, let's say, brings one's mortality into view, but something that is chronic, and let's say either they have to have a medicine that manages the symptoms but then makes their brain foggy, or chronic pain of some sort. What is your advice to them to help them stay on the path?
Do the best you can, keep a clean conscience, trust God, and move on. And,
I love that.
If you're born without legs, you can't do the salat. That isn't going to hold you back on the path. That isn't going to keep you from knowing God.
Yeah. And, additionally, there are all kinds of impairments that one might have. But it could be like when one is trying to focus on the invocation and somebody is revving their motorcycle outside your window.
Sure, directly now.
You may have a loud distraction. It may be somatic or whatever. And you remember what's important, and you do what you can, and you don't do what you can't.
Right.
And that's important to remember.
Clean conscience in the process, and trust God for the rest.
Right. But it's important not to believe that you're always falling short because you can't do what others can do. You do what you can do. That's your assignment.
Yes, or that's insufficient before God.
Right.
Seda Badriya, I noted in my answer a tone that sounded argumentative. I did not mean that.
No, not at all. It's a good answer, but I was thinking, based on your answer, would you say that maybe since all of the religious texts have essentially been written by able-bodied people, that perhaps we should be looking for people with various disabilities to give their own view of practice, and that maybe they, due to certain physical impairments, may have a more apt esoteric interpretation of what we, for all these years, have thought of as actual physical interpretations of things. Like, if you look to the Quran, a lot of it is ambiguous, but we always go to the Sunnah, and we're like, oh, the Salah has to be physical. We don't think of it as a mental Salah.
Right, but if you're paralyzed, the physical Salah is just not operative.
I might add, I think of the mental Salah frequently. Because it isn't that I'm not pretty much able-bodied, but it's that God has put me in circumstances where that's the right answer. And it must be analogous.
Well, and you know, in Christian writings, I think you do find, I mean, I'm not extensively read, but I think you do find things that are attributed to so-and-so the lame and so-and-so the blind. Right. And I'm sure there have been blind spiritual masters. So, I don't know.
Yes, and similarly, there are a lot of advantages that are provided by the modern world that makes things available to and from people who have compromises. Historically, blind people didn't write much, have known or seen with their inner sense.
In fact, that's something that I think is sorely missing in the Islamic tradition, because if you look to, let's say, a lot of the European pagan traditions, the Nordic and also the ancient Greek traditions, Tiresias, for example, all of the prophets and seers are almost always blind. And also, you have the example of Vulcan or Hephaestus, who was the greatest craftsperson, created all of the greatest weapons of the gods, but yet he was having a physical disability. And so I think that's something that perhaps the Semitic traditions need to learn from.
Yeah, I think examples like that, I think they may be something about the Semitic worldview that is a little bit too literal to appreciate the fact that someone may be positively blind because they see with the eye of the heart and not with the eyes in the head. And so the stories about people like that may be just more noteworthy in a different worldview. And I don't know what can be done about it, except that you can easily point out that the eye of the heart is the sight that really matters.
And to some degree, it's certainly a point well taken to know that the three Abrahamic monotheisms are addressed to people who have a certain worldview and a certain world situation, and antecedent traditions that provide context. What do I mean? I mean, monotheisms, the Mediterranean monotheism, they refer to God as the King, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. That, from the context of Persian history, I suppose, the very forms of places of worship look like palaces. And goodness, they also look like courts. The courtroom is the same. And in Protestantism, the priests wear judges' robes. It's all kind of cut of the same cloth.
That's what I meant, I think, when I said literal, using the concrete for communication. And apparently the Semites, by the time it gets to the Hebrews anyway, they don't have a rich symbolic mythology to draw upon. And I don't know, it is strange, but maybe they threw the baby out with the bathwater when they became monotheists. But it is something peculiar, the concreteness.
Yes, agreeing with you and citing the phenomenon is, I think, true, well, and good. But I think these conversations should be about comparative religion.
Right, and I also think it's worth remembering that it doesn't necessarily exclude or include Islamic perspective in this discussion, because even if you were to look at, from an Islamic point of view, the prophets and the messengers that came, Moses had a stuttering issue, and his speech stammered. So there's a whole story about Moses about how he wasn't able to communicate and how he was fearful of this disability that he had.
Right. Yeah. Well, there is that example. And God said, yeah, go ahead, use Aaron.
Right, exactly. So, like you said, I don't think it's a comparison, because I'm sure Moses is just one amongst many prophets that we don't even know about that may or may not have a physical disability.
Right. And the way I was thinking of it is because monotheism seemed to be more literalistic in their language and more concept.
To flip things on its head, we're saying that we should look to one's intention and that there should be dispensations for people depending on their circumstance. What would you say about those people that follow the law of a religion like Islam, but not the spirit? Let's say those that are fasting every day in Ramadan, but then having a huge feast and eating way too much at the end of the day. Should they be chastised?
Not necessarily. I mean, their imbalance is clear. I'm not sure. On a case-by-case basis, somebody might profit from having that pointed out to them.
I don't think it's certainly not a role that I want to play, to go to them unsolicited and chastise them for what I think is an excess. If they're interested in the spiritual path, then that opens a different level of discussion in which one can ask those questions. But I think in all of these things, and the kind of spirituality we're here to talk about and celebrate together, it isn't a matter of chastisement. It's a matter of opening a conversation to people who are interested in changing and transcending themselves. And if they're not interested in that, I'm not going to go chastise them, because I don't care and they don't care.
That person is probably looking more for sublime tastes than sublime spirituality, and is probably not an esoterist.
Right, and I think that's kind of what we have to limit ourselves here to. There are a lot of terrible excesses I see around us perpetrated in the name of religion, not only in society, but people in terms of their own progress and path and understanding. And that's the way it is.
Except that I don't have any hypocrisy in my life.
No, and if you do, I'll point it out.
But since I think this fits better, I'm going to skip the second two questions and come back to them and ask the fourth one, which is, how would you respond to criticisms from Orthodox Muslims that a lot of what you seem to be talking about almost implicitly rejects the Sunnah and focuses on the Quran? A lot of what your answers come to sounds like some of the Quran-only Muslims. How would you respond to those criticisms?
I would say the Sunnah provides answers for people who have questions for whom those provide answers.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
And they express example of the prophet, and a literalist will try to do everything exactly the same way in great detail, and someone who is less so will get the flavor of the attitudes and grace and character and things like that.
And actually, I suppose, personally speaking, I do hold the Quran in higher authority than any interpretation.
Sure. Well, you know, there are some hadith Qudsi that
certainly seem at the same level.
Yeah, they seem to be. But, you know, if you want to play safe, Quran is authoritative if you can just coax the truth out of it.
And should we view the Quran as something that is holy and something that should be interpreted as it is, or should we look at it more along the lines of one very specific great text from one very specific great mystic?
Well, it's bigger than any one mystic, even though it came through one. But
what was the first part of that?
So one way, I guess, one could interpret the Quran is the way that the majority of Muslims do. But then another way, you could almost say that it's like Muhammad's a mystic, like Ibn Arabi, and the Quran is his Futuhat al-Makkiyah in a sense. And so it's not something that you have to bring forth into the modern world in toto, but that there are parts of it that are no longer relevant. Do you view it this way, or do you think that it's an eternal text of sorts?
Not in its literalness. I mean, every revelation occurs in a time and a place.
Yes, and through a particular lens.
Yes, and going to be limited necessarily in the process of manifesting. And so if you're a literalist, then you'll have to run around in the Quran and say, oh, no, wait, what do I do? This stuff seems to say exactly the same thing as it does over here. And it's kind of like, oh, I don't know. You know, we don't live in the same world where we don't have in the modern world. And
yes, the Quran, after all, was addressed to a particular people. And there are a lot of things that transcend the notion of place and time in there. But there are a lot of things that don't. Address a particular context.
If there's a question where the literal meaning seems hard to apply, then look deeper.
Yes, and in the same sense, the Quran says itself there have been other revelations that have come and gone, and presumably for those reasons, instead of looking at those things, vie with one another in good works.
And may I just add that I was once told that if you have read a verse in the Quran and gathered the same meaning that you got first time you read that verse, then you haven't really read that verse. So every time you read a particular verse, you should be going away understanding it in a different context, or it should reveal to you some secrets within it. It should actually never be the same as you read before, despite of it being the same verse that was read before.
Yeah, that's a good principle.
Well, yes, and it's a good example of this principle, because that's a good principle to carry, that things should always be new and there's always more than you see. But it doesn't mean that if you read a verse and it says the same thing to you that you fail.
Right. Ideally, it would deepen at the very least.
And it may sometimes.
And it may have something to do with the fact that you've accumulated more experience between the two times.
Right.
And you have more to apply it to.
Right, but Quran is one of those texts that's infinitely deep.
Very good. One last part of that I would ask, you mentioned that the Quran is infinitely deep. Are there any texts outside of the revealed text that you would also consider infinitely deep?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out.
And that's also a matter of definition, because if something is infinitely deep, you could say it's revealed.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, if you look at someone like Ibn Arabi, you might make the distinction between Mriti and Shruti within his writings.
It's not a very productive discussion, because then you start wondering, well, okay, are the Vedas revealed? Yes. Are the Upanishads? Yes. Well, are some more revealed than others? Are some deeper than others?
They certainly are for me, but someone else may find that the other one is deeper.
It's all relative at the end of the day, isn't it?
Well, yeah, in a sense. But I don't think it's important to have to be precise. I think it's enough if you recognize the existence of revealed messages and try to benefit from them.
Yes, and I think really and practically, that's what we all should be doing, is trying to understand these things and ponder them in our heart and see if they are helpful in opening ourselves to the presence of God. And it may or may not be helpful to say, well, am I doing this with a revealed text, or have the same experience with novels? You look
but if you read the same novel several times, it probably doesn't keep getting deeper the way a revealed text does. But nonetheless, anything you read may open a point of view from which you see the truth better.
Right.
That's actually a great point. I'm reminded of something D.H. Lawrence wrote in his Apocalypse, which is sort of like his revealed text, where he said that the books that are most worth reading are the ones that you can read an infinite number of times and continue to get something new out of them.
Yeah, that makes sense, too.
Sure. That's a good perspective methodologically, because one wants to grow and change rather than see the same truth again and again.
Right. it's better to be reminded at a deeper level each time.
Yeah, better have a different view of this.
Well, it's true. Sometimes it turns upside down. You can see how Meister Eckhart does that in some of his sermons. But of course, in that case, you can see that it's provisional. But we could have provisional insights too, and not say, oh, well, I have to be able to apply that point of view to everything.
Right.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Does someone that shows poor judgment and no compassion by, let's say, deciding to register for the Republican Party, does that disqualify one from the spiritual path?
Well, the no compassion may, but I'm aware of one very good spiritual teacher who leans in the Republican direction, not in the Trump direction. And there are legitimate reasons that we've had a right-left division, but it's completely insane today. And I think that the political right tends to have less compassion and empathy. It's a type that likes to know answers and not necessarily understand depth. I think there are a lot more of those on the Republican side than the Democrat side. But even the traditional Republican insistence on being responsible for one's condition, while it's limited, is still valuable. And so anyway, I don't want to say anything bad about Republicans other than the ones that, are obviously off the rails.
Yes, to start with, of course you know I'm a registered Republican, right?
No.
But I'd like to respond to this question at a much more important level, which is, what is something that disqualifies someone from a spiritual path? What is that? It certainly wouldn't be the fact that they need it more than others because they have less compassion.
True.
So what would disqualify someone from turning to God?
Nothing at all.
And gaining compassion. And they might gain the very compassion that makes them seem so unqualified.
It's religion that makes that possible.
I think there are character traits and pathologies that, for all practical purposes, especially the pathologies, you can say they might as well hang it up. They're never going to get even the first idea of the spiritual path. And I would put Donald Trump in that category, and certain psychopaths, which may include Donald Trump too. But it's on the practical level. It's like if you don't have a certain level of basic intelligence, you're not likely to be able to follow the path with ordinary guidance. God may still reveal himself to you, but if you, by the time you get to the end of a sentence, the first words have disappeared and you can't hold it together, it doesn't mean your heart is closed, but there are very few spiritual paths that have a form that would make it possible for somebody like that. But there are esoteric schools within Kshatriya, the martial arts. And if their profession is going out and slashing people for the emperor, you wouldn't say that they lack compassion and are inherently violent people and have no hope.
That's why it's so hard to look across cultural and historical.
But I think in principle you can say that for a normal path, there are people that are too abnormal, and that on the practical level they're not going to benefit. But God has the last word. But I know I wouldn't exert a whole lot of effort trying to get past someone's pathologies if they don't show an interest in getting free of them.
Anyway, we'll move on to the next question. In one of your talks, you mentioned embracing our obstacles the way a tree would, which became one with the fence. How can one best do this without giving in to the totality of the obstacle and letting it overtake one?
I think I give the same answer I gave at the start about disability. One does one's best. One trusts in God for the rest.
Well, and when you say embracing the obstacle, how different is that from spiritual resignation and accepting God's will? Because we can incorporate our life situation into our spiritual path, but you do it by sacralizing the obstacle or what it represents and not giving in to it beyond the sense of you have to accept what is.
Yes, there's that boundary between accepting what is
and approving.
Yes, some measure trying to oppose something.
Right. I have heard the quote from Jesus that resist not evil. I have heard that rendered as do not oppose that which opposes you. so as not to live reactively and out of resistance all the time.
Yes, or a point I often try to make about don't take your identity from that which you oppose.
Right. Definitely not that. And life should have a flow. If you can't flow around the obstacle, there's an obstacle that won't move and you can't flow around it, well, I don't know. Life ought to still be able to have a flow. The river continues to flow around a large obstacle sitting in it. So, I don't know. The giving in sounds like giving up, but acceptance of something that you can't change in the moment, you may be able to change it in another moment, you kind of have to do that. Some of the things that we have to accept we view as obstacles, and they seem to offer...
Yes, and I think much of the message here is to accept what you have to accept, but not be preoccupied with it, but place your focus, your attention, your ambition, as it were, on that which is holy or beyond the obstacle.
Right. And to play with words a little bit, you may have an obstacle, but don't let the obstacle have you.
Yes.
That was it for questions for tonight, but I did just now think of this other one that I think is important. For someone that is part of a spiritual community, let's say the Mariamia, Tariqa, or something else, but they live in a location without any other like-minded figures. And let's say they're a Muslim, but the Muslims all around them are conservative, but they find joy from, let's say, some sort of esoteric Christian community. Is that something that you think is a good thing? Should they be spending more time with, let's say, people that are like-minded in terms of their faith or like-minded in terms of their esotericism?
Well, I would choose the esotericism if I have to choose one. But there's also the possibility that one might like to be part of a neighborly community and go to the mosque for prayers once a week and maybe attend a communal meal of some kind. But you may get your best nourishment from a group of esoteric Christians whom you could also have as friends. It might be either or, but it doesn't have to be either or.
Finally, you have to take your spiritual nourishment where you can find it. And if it's with a group of esoteric Christians or some other group, and if you have the nature and the temperament that needs or requires companionship and dialogue, that's what you have to do.
Yeah, then you go with the esoteric Christians.
Right, you have to nourish your soul, and to the degree that simply the form, although you may find it beautiful, does not energize you or does not open you up as much as dialogue and camaraderie with other spiritual travelers does, then you have to make that decision.
Right. I have been nourished by Christianity myself quite a bit. And I used to date a woman who was Orthodox, and I would go to church with her, and I found it very nourishing. And the first time I experienced an Orthodox liturgy, I just had tears running down my face. Mm-hmm. So there was, but yet I knew I didn't belong, but yet the liturgy was still nourishing. So I didn't feel like I belonged to their community, but I certainly enjoyed partaking of the spirituality that was available there.
Yes, I had that experience fairly recently. The very same experience in South Carolina with Brother James.
Yes. A good Orthodox congregation, while perhaps hard to find, although there's something communicated in the liturgy done properly regardless. And so there's no reason why, being Westerners, we can't eat at a Chinese restaurant.
Is that answering your question, Peter?
Yes, thank you. Though there are people now that say, that's cultural appropriation. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, when I attended the Orthodox liturgy, I did not partake of the sacrament because I respected it too much. And I'm not sure if they had known I was a Muslim, they would have encouraged me. But they would have allowed me, not knowing that anyway. But I just thought, that's just too confusing. Somebody were to find out I was a Muslim and I was taking the sacrament every Sunday, I think it would be very inconsiderate to put other people in that position of having to try to figure that out.
Right.
I encourage everybody to find a beautiful Orthodox liturgy to go to once in a while, or at least enough times to feel it, because it's wonderful. I felt like the Orthodoxy I encountered, and it was fortunately a good group. It was a good priest, and it was Antiochian, which is what James is, isn't it? And, well, it's something worth tasting, really is.
Well, I think specifically to the last question, I remember reading several letters and discourses by Sidi al-Bashir, and the same question being asked, and I think ultimately the answer, which we already gave, is whether it comes down to a community or a teacher or a specific path, the question one has to ask is this nourishing? And has that nourishment led to any transformation? That is it. That is personal. It doesn't reflect what others are doing. It doesn't reflect what particular affiliation they have with the community or not. It simply reflects their own journey on the path.
Yes, in many ways, it's a knowledge based on knowledge of their own temperament, and that's often decisive. And knowing one's temperament will allow people to make decisions like, do I need a community? Can I be a solitary? And so forth and so on. But those are questions not about the validity of the form, but about one's own availability to these things.
Was there any other questions, Advaita Vedanta, for tonight?
No, that was it.
I'd just like to reiterate the importance of knowing, exploring, and understanding one's own temperament, which has a lot to do with one's practice.
Right. And I think, if I may, also include the element of judgment that we have acquired, or at least I have acquired, judging oneself and judging others, and that can be an obstacle on the path.
Yes, it could be a big one. It's the sin of pride, really.
Yes. It's kind of an inversion that you don't see right away. But who is doing the judging but the aspect of the soul, of the nafs, believes it's better than that, and is reassuring itself that it's better than that by judging it.
Absolutely.
And that also can lead to a useless complacency. We can judge all of these other things as a relatively less or sometimes unimportant or valueless because we know what we have. Well, that's not enough. You have to do with what you have. And if what you are doing is making value judgments, it's really standing in your way of learning.
Right. And one of the best things that I think can happen on the path is that you become more aware of those things that you might judge in order that you not judge them. Because you learn, that's self-knowledge. You learn what pushes your buttons. And every judgment of somebody else is an open invitation to turn it around and say, what do I have in me that's like that? And it's more valuable used that way than setting somebody else right in your own mind.
Right.
I mean, the habit of judging other people is corrosive. It isn't just the wrong thing to do. It's destructive to oneself.
Yes, that's right.
I think in all things we need to take a middle path, like the Buddha taught, in the sense that definitely there's too much judging going on in the world, too much anger, too much hatred. You witness this with road rage and then people on Twitter or whatnot in social media judging everybody else. But on the other hand, just the other day, I saw someone beating their dog in public, and I judged them, and I got very angry with them, and I think justifiably so, because even in the Sunnah, one thing a person absolutely cannot do is treat an animal with disrespect and violence.
Yes, exactly. You don't give up your discernment, but in the best case, you know that that person mistreating the animal is doing so unknowingly because of his own pain, and that something has got him to that point in his life on this day in this place, which doesn't mean that you keep quiet, because we've got discernment. If it's wrong, do something for the sake of the dog.
Yes, clearly.
If you can call out someone's misbehavior and then leave the situation and just drop it. then that's not judgmentalism.
Yes, judgment is not necessarily judgmentalism, and let us not conflate somebody beating his dog with somebody choosing to be in a different Eureka.
Very important distinction.